Welcome to Stat's virtual event, The Next Battles in the War Against HIV, sponsored by ViV Healthcare. Thanks for joining us. I'm Nicholas St. Fleur, a general assignment reporter and associate editorial director of events here at STAT. And before we get started, let's go over a few quick housekeeping items, though I'm sure you're all experts in Zoom by now. At the bottom of your screen, you should see several icons. Use the chat feature to chat amongst yourselves or to send a message directly to the STAT team, which appears as STAT Events. But please, don't put your questions for us in the chat. If you do have a question for the panel during the event, please use the Q&A feature to type your question, and we'll try to answer it live. In the Q&A window, you should also be able to see the questions that other attendees have asked and upvote the questions you want to see answered. We will be taking questions throughout the chat, so please don't wait until the end to submit. And today we have a very exciting conversation, so let's make sure we get those questions flowing. That's part of what makes these events so engaging. Thanks again to all of you for being here. Before we get started, I'd like to welcome Dr. Kimberly Smith, SVP and Head of Research and Development at ViV Healthcare, for a sponsored introduction of today's event. Take it away, Kimberly.
Thank you, Nicholas, and good afternoon, everyone. As Nicholas said, I'm Dr. Kimberly Smith, Head of Research and Development at ViV Healthcare, the only company in the world that's 100% focused on HIV. I'm an infectious disease physician by training, and before coming to ViV, I spent nearly 20 years treating people living with HIV and researching HIV. I made the move to industry because ViV was a unique company, and I felt like it gave me the opportunity to have an impact beyond my local community and actually a global impact. And so I did that about 8 years ago, and I can tell you that I've enjoyed every aspect of it since. And it is giving me that opportunity to talk to people like you and to engage the world in how we get to a better place in fighting the HIV epidemic. I began my career at the start of the AIDS crisis in Chicago at Rush University Medical Center. And since coming into my career in that beginning of the epidemic, I was present for what we now sort of refer to as the bad old days, the time when we saw young, previously healthy people admitted to the hospital with horrible disease, and we fought hard to save their lives, and sometimes we were not successful. We saw young folks succumbing to this horrible disease. But remarkably, over the course of my career, I've seen incredible scientific advancements that have resulted in therapies that allow individuals to live long lives with HIV. And now we see individuals living with HIV lengths of time comparable to people who are not living with HIV. But I've also seen enduring stigma that remains and still negatively impacts the communities to this day. In my current role at ViV, I oversee the company's pipeline of medicines from discovery to cure. Every day, I join my colleagues in driving innovation that supports our mission of leaving no person living with HIV behind. I'm excited to convene this video chat today for a very timely conversation on the ways that we can work together to overcome barriers to implementing HIV services, testing, and treatment. Just last month, the HIV and AIDS community marked 40 years since the CDC's initial report of 5 cases of pneumocystis pneumonia among previously healthy men in Los Angeles. These 5 cases, identified in 1981, would eventually be recognized as the first official reports of AIDS. To commemorate that anniversary, we must remember the more than 32 million people who have died from AIDS worldwide since the start of the global epidemic, and the 38 million people currently living with HIV today. The tools at our disposal to treat HIV today are very different than what was available in the early days of the epidemic in the 80s and 90s. And since the introduction of antiretroviral treatment, survival rates, as I mentioned, are longer, and life expectancy is almost equal among individuals who have HIV compared to those who don't. However, in some ways, we're victims of our own success. The success and the effectiveness of our current treatments, plus the current burden of COVID-19, have sort of put HIV epidemic on the back burner, even while many individuals around the world remain disconnected from services to treat their HIV and prevent it. Whether the public knows it or not, we're still firmly in the grips of the global HIV epidemic. To put that into perspective, HIV remains a global health challenge. The WHO and UNAIDS estimate there are 1.7 new HIV cases per year. The burden remains the greatest in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's a heartbreaking fact that around 6,000 adolescent girls and young women are infected each week. In the US and Europe, the epidemic continues to disproportionately impact people of color and predominantly men who have sex with men. Of the estimated 38 million people living with HIV, 1 in 5 are not aware of their status, 1 in 3 are not accessing treatment, and 2 in 5 are not virologically suppressed. It's this group of individuals, the one who've been unable to suppress their virus, either because they're not connected to care, or their treatment hasn't been successful, or they can't consistently stay on medicines. This is the major part of why the HIV epidemic persists. Our collective efforts to engage these individuals and ensure they are aware of their status, ensure they're connected to effective health care and effective HIV-specific care, and ensure that they're suppressing their virus will be critical to our efforts to end the epidemic. So where should we focus? Until there's an effective HIV vaccine or cure, we must continue to make tremendous efforts towards getting to the end of the epidemic. One of those efforts is the concept of treatment as prevention, which refers to HIV medication to prevent the transmission of HIV. There's a mountain of evidence that has shown that individuals who are on effective antiretroviral treatment with an undetectable viral load cannot transmit HIV to others. This is the foundation of U equals U, or undetectable equals untransmittable, and is one of the most highly effective options we have for preventing HIV transmission. But further, if we're going to stop the spread of HIV, the second most essential area is in the area of PrEP, or pre-exposure prophylaxis. When it's prescribed, PrEP is extremely effective at preventing sexual transmission of HIV. However, despite that effectiveness and the presence of FDA approval for PrEP since 2012, uptake among individuals who could benefit from PrEP is low in the United States. Only about 20% of individuals who could benefit from PrEP are currently taking it in the US. And this is especially low among individuals who are disproportionately affected, like Black and Latino individuals, who represent more than 2/3 of the new cases in the US and comprise only 24% of the PrEP users. It's a simple reality that those that need prevention most are not the ones who are getting it. So as the rollout of PrEP continues, the issues we're seeing with disproportionate access must be addressed. But despite these disparities, I am optimistic. Just last week, we concluded the 2020 meeting from the International AIDS Society, one of the most important scientific meetings of the year for HIV science. To see how far we've come in the discussion around HIV prevention in the last 10 years can't be understated. The meeting had more than 200 abstracts dedicated specifically to this topic. We're also researching groundbreaking new options in the field of treatment and prevention with medicines with dosing intervals from 1 week to 1 year instead of every day. We have creative options for administration, including injections and implants. And finally, we just want more people to know that we are working on a cure. many investigators around the world. Progress is slow, but we're determined. So in conclusion, ultimately, many efforts are underway to end the HIV epidemic, with prevention being important along with comprehensive access to treatment. Today's discussion in partnership with staff offers an excellent opportunity to continue to advance this overarching dialogue further to inspire collective action. To be successful in our goal of ending the HIV epidemic, we must continue to collaborate and advance the way HIV is managed to ensure that no person living with or affected by HIV or AIDS is left behind. I am excited to be joined today by Drs. Allison Agwu, Ogachika Alozi, and Dr. Helen Gale, along with Nicholas St. Fleur, who will discuss their perspectives on what must come next to end the HIV epidemic. Back to you, Nick.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that incredible introduction, Dr. Smith. I really appreciate it. And I think it gives our audience quite the starting place for our discussion. So here to join me for the remaining editorial portion of today's event, I'd like to also introduce our expert panel. And I'd love to remind our viewers to please put any questions you have in the chat. So to begin, we have Dr. Allison Agwu, who is a professor of pediatrics and internal medicine in the Division of Infectious Diseases, also program director of the Pediatric Adolescent Young Adult HIV/AIDS program, and medical director of the Accessing Care Early Clinic at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Dr. Ogechika Alozi, who is CEO of Sunset ID Care, and Dr. Helene Gale, President and CEO of Chicago Community Trust. And just a quick note to all of our viewers out there. Unfortunately, Dr. Gale does have to leave a bit early during our conversation. So don't worry if you see her leave our screen. We will continue our conversation with the rest of the panel up until about 2 p.m. Eastern. But if you have any specific questions for her, please do ask them early. So with that, let's get into it. A big welcome to the three of you, and thanks again for taking the time to be here virtually.
Thanks.
So we are 40 years into the HIV epidemic in the United States. Dr. Agwu, I'd love to just start with you. If you could tell us a little bit about, where we are right now. As Dr. Smith had said, we're past the bad old days. What is the landscape now for HIV?
Sure, and I Dr. Smith really framed things really beautifully. I think 40 years in, I'm excited as a provider to be able to say that we have more options than we've ever had. And I think that's a critical piece, and including discussions about injectable options and subcutaneous options, et cetera. So I think we have more options than we ever have. We have funding to be able to support people living with HIV, which is great. And I'm taking a domestic lens, let me say this. And we have, stigma has reduced, it's not gone. I was struck by Dr. Smith's comment about the bad old days where young people came in and died with this mysterious illness that we later defined as HIV. I mentioned all the things that we've moved forward with, but I can say that stigma is still very much alive, because I can still say the bad old days are here with us, where I still have young people dying because they cannot won't adhere the challenges of adhering to medications or access to medicine for so much, or the stigma is so great that they rather die with their HIV hidden, right? And die of cancer and not tell anybody and be unsupported. I think we've come a long way, but by no means are we done.
And now to ask Dr. Gale, you've been fighting this battle for decades here. I'd love if you could tell us a bit about, how we, a bit about how we got to where we are now. If you could put the landscape into context.
Yeah, so thanks. And again, thanks for putting this together. And it's wonderful to be with our incredible other panelists, and Dr. Smith's comments were really so right on target. And I think, in many ways, where we are is, as she said, almost a result of our success. we were able to fairly rapidly come up with life-saving medications that made a difference in people's lives. It in some ways did reduce the stigma, and it left us with what we know happens so often with diseases that disproportionately impact those who are already impacted with other health diseases, other economic diseases. We're at that last mile where what we need to do is different than what got us to where we are today. And, it was for those who had great access to care, for those who were more in a position to focus on prevention and access to prevention technologies, their lives have changed dramatically. But we know that people who are often the most vulnerable, and particularly communities of color, don't have that same kind of access, don't always have the information, and are still living with extreme stigma around HIV and AIDS. And so in many ways, we were able to take advantage of incredible medical breakthroughs. But, now is that last mile of how do we really make sure that we're reaching those who are still disproportionately impacted. And I will also just say, in the early days, everyone was talking about HIV. I couldn't get into a cab without having a discussion about HIV. Now, if you talk about HIV, most people think it's not an issue and don't really, it has become this kind of silent killer that continues to impact communities that are already impacted by so many other health and social economic issues.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gale. And again, I would like to remind our audience, if you have any questions specifically for Dr. Gale, I would encourage you to ask them now, or at least soon. Dr. Allozy, to pick up where Dr. Gale and Dr. Agwu had left off, could you tell us a bit about, how this disease, how we approach this disease, how it has changed over the course of your work, and as well as, what we can do going forward to help battle stigmas as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thanks for having me. And I think Dr. Smith did a good job of teeing it up, and Drs. Agwu and Gale have also added to the conversation. I think one of the things when I think about how things have changed, not just in terms of the therapeutics and where it's mentioned, and I often have this conversation with colleagues that are also physicians. They're like, hey, why isn't HIV in the news anymore, like Dr. Gale alluded to? And part of the issue is that we don't have an Easy E anymore. We don't have a Magic Johnson, right? We don't have a Rock Hudson. And we hope not to have, but because of that, right, in the world that we live in, we haven't had the it celebrity that's been affected by HIV that keeps it front of the press. And so a lot of people, whether they're clinicians or non-clinicians, come into this space and they ask all the time, well, is HIV still a thing? What are you guys doing for it? Is it still those 12 drugs that you used to give? And it's amazing to me when I have primary care colleagues, dermatology colleagues, orthopedic surgeon colleagues, and they'll have a patient with HIV and they'll literally call as a clinical emergency, right? That the sky is falling, and it kind of makes me chuckle. I think sort of to answer your specific question, what that does show is that somehow, some way, in some shape and form, we're failing a generation of clinicians coming out of a host of educational settings. They don't have to be doctors. It can be MPs, PAs, pharmacists, nurses, whatever. There's a generation in healthcare that sort of missed the boat on HIV. And in a sense, like Dr. Gale alluded to, we're a victim of our own success, right? Going from 12 meds multiple times a day, horrendous side effects, pancreatitis, bone issues, GI issues, to a single tablet regimen that essentially has no side effects and 90+% of the time, and the efficacy is 90+%. In fact, we've spoiled ourselves to the extent that if somebody comes in and says, hey, I have a new drug and it's below 90% efficacy, we laugh. We're like, well, why would we do that? Right? Where in every other place in medicine, they'd be rejoicing. And so I do think that one of the things that we need to do as a collective, and I know the AETC is doing it, ViiV is doing it, a host of other organizations, is sort of step back and refocus on how do we get this next generation of healthcare workers to come into healthcare, understanding that HIV, the stigma should be lowered. They are a part of that conversation. And how do they make it part of their general practice, right? So they're not afraid of PrEP, they're not afraid of NPEP or PEP. And I think that really has to be something, especially in the HBCU community, if we understand that 51+% of new infections are coming tip of Texas to the Atlantic Ocean. If we fail in the South, where those HBCUs are, we have failed as a generation to combat the next wave of HIV or the next sort of setting of HIV.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alozzi. I want to direct this question at Dr. Gale here, a reader question or a viewer question, if you will. Wilmore Webley asks, what role do you think local and national media can play in awareness and education of the American public? Will we ever get back to a place where HIV/AIDS is seen as an important disease to talk about?
Well, first of all, I would say, the media has a huge role to play. We as physicians, clinicians, and healthcare providers, kind of do retail health education, if you will. We, tend to talk to individual patients. We, may talk to individual communities, but, the media has the ability to reach wider audiences. And so, just like the media has, really shaped in many ways our thinking about COVID and the COVID crisis, I think we can do the same around, continuing to make sure that people recognize the importance of where we are with HIV. I also think that, there's a real opportunity to interweave HIV with other diseases and other social and economic conditions, because I think, while HIV in and of itself is critically important, I think there's so many other ways in which we can talk about HIV and how it's interconnected so that, it really does get the proper attention it needs, but thinking about it in an integrated way. We're not where we were in the mid 1980s when HIV first came, unknown, extreme crisis. We're at a different phase. We're, at a endemic phase. So I think we need to talk about it differently, because I think we don't want to raise an alarm that people then say, well, why did you make this, into a crisis, when what it is a slow burning death machine. And I think we need to talk about it in ways that put it into perspective around where we are today, but particularly, who's most impacted by this pandemic. And I also would say not only is the media important, but also, continuing to work with messengers within the community. And, one of the things that I think we learned so much from the HIV pandemic that we're also now doing with COVID is really reaching out to communities and meeting them where they are. And I think there's still more room for doing that.
And Dr. Gale, you have really been, a leader during this COVID pandemic. I would love to hear a bit about what lessons we have learned from the COVID pandemic that we can apply to the HIV epidemic. You just beautifully explained some of the lessons we learned from the HIV epidemic to apply to the COVID pandemic. What about what we've just learned within the past year?
Well, first of all, I think our belief in science is at an all-time high, even though we know that there's a lot of misinformation about the vaccines. We did something amazing to, in a short period of time, develop a vaccine. And we've been trying for decades to develop an HIV vaccine. And obviously, there are different viruses, how they mutate, how they change, all of that is different. But I think it should reinvigorate our sense that it is possible to have scientific breakthroughs and to have them in record time. I also think we more rapidly recognized how disproportionately this was going to impact communities of color and otherwise economic communities living in poverty, and the impact and the interface between health and economic, because this is a pandemic, the COVID pandemic, that really had a huge economic impact, and so did HIV. And I don't think that we always recognize the interconnection between the broader social determinants of health, if you will, and HIV. So, I think there's a lot. And I do think in COVID, we have more rapidly looked at what does access mean in a more holistic way. Access isn't just, vaccines are available. Access is, what does it take for somebody to actually get to a vaccine, take time off of work, take a sick day if they need a sick day, get childcare, and some of these other things. And so I think there's a lot more that we could do to make some of what is available for people living with HIV or people who want to prevent HIV infection, that we could learn from how vigorously we mobilize to make sure that access was more than just saying, here's a medication at a certain site, but what does it take to really make sure that people access what's available?
So Dr. Gale, what are you optimistic about going forward, whether it be from the therapeutics or the treatment side or the public health side of things, in terms of ending this epidemic
of HIV? Yeah. Well, I'm an eternal optimist, or I wouldn't be doing. I wouldn't have done many of the things that I have done. So I believe it is possible. I believe we have today a lot of the tools that could make a difference, both in prevention and obviously in treatment. And so I think that if we put the will behind it, and if we mobilize communities, and if we mobilize our resources, our health resources, I think that we could go to elimination. That doesn't mean elimination in the sense that it doesn't exist, but it gets to a point where it is really at such a low level that is no longer causing the kind of health disparities that it currently causes. So I'm optimistic that we can do it. A lot of it is just about the will. And, I think the question we all have to ask ourselves is, do we have the will to go that next step to really make this a rare occurrence in our country as well as around the world?
Thank you so much, Dr. Gale. And Dr. Agwu, Dr. Gale, you had said, you've done a lot of work in this area. And Dr. Agwu, you had shared with us during our prep call a little anecdote about Dr. Gale and her work. I'd love if you could share it with our audience.
Sure. I'm a little awestruck/starstruck today because, honestly, she told me not to say the year, so I won't say the year to put her on blast. But when I was really a young medical student, one of Dr. Gale's articles on adolescents with HIV struck me. And it really is what guided me to the field that I now still engage in, which is adolescents and young adults at risk or living with HIV. And just have never had an opportunity to thank her. So thank you for inspiring me.
Well, thank you. I am honored. And I don't really mind the decades that I've served. I feel very proud and pleased to have had a career that has allowed me to, do some of the things that, hopefully meant that I gave back. And, I think that's what we're all trying to do in our own way and in different vantage points, see if we can make a difference in these things that we know cause real devastation in people's lives. And, as you were talking, I hearken back to, some of the very early days when I talked to, particularly gay men in communities of color who, would rather say that they were, in some cases would rather say they were a drug addict than admit that they were gay, or that they would rather say that they died of cancer than, talk about some of these issues. And I just think we've got to break through the stigma. We've got to talk openly and honestly about, how people contract the disease, what the issues are, and do this in a way that accepts that, we're all part of the human family. And, what we're looking for is how we have equity in health.
Thank you so much. And I'd love to stay on this topic, as Dr. Agwu had brought up, of young adults and adolescents. In the year of 2021, what are the different challenges when it comes to addressing, young adults, young adolescents in terms of HIV? You have spoken a lot to me about, really meeting your patients where they are. So what is that landscape looking like today?
Yeah, so I'm excited that Dr. Luzzi is on because I think tech is a huge part of this in terms of meeting young people where they are. And, it's great for us to talk in our journal articles and in spaces where we read and congratulate each other, but we're not meeting them where they are, which is TikToking, WhatsApping, and all those things in order to get the messages to them. I've often said in terms of even prevention, with if Beyonce had talked about a blue pill when Jay-Z cheated on her with Becky, maybe everybody'd be taking Truvada for PrEP, right? So when we talk about the popular people with HIV or sharing, what about people talking about prevention as a normal part of sexual health and living as we WAP and do all those other things? And so I think really it's not about being quote unquote cool or trying to be young yourself, because I'm definitely not that, but it's truly talking in a language that they understand and meeting them at a space where it's just a normal part of their health and development. You know, when we talk about stigma, some of you may be aware of the rapper The Baby's comments recently about HIV and AIDS, and really take you back to the early 80s, but that's a popular rapper with young people. And so imagine the stamp on stigma and how that took us back. And so I think when we talked about the media responsibility, taking that as an opportunity to get into the spaces where young people are and actually start talking about HIV and AIDS and where we are, and to debunk that stigma, but also as an opportunity to how to move forward. You know, I think in terms of young people, a lot of times the population that I deal with, by the time they got the HIV diagnosis, they may not have seen a doctor in 10 years, et cetera, the last time they needed a physical for what have you, right? We passed the point of regular checkups where we get all our vaccines, et cetera. And so nobody's quote unquote thinking about or talking about even sexual health or reduction, et cetera, these young people. And so they normally developmentally are in this invisible stage where they go on, they live. The most important thing is how you look, right? And pushing the envelopes, et cetera. And you can judge your partners by how they look. They look clean, so they are clean. They look like they're free of STIs, and they are, right? If we're even aware of STIs, because honestly, some of the sexual health education is truly challenged in addressing what risk is and does not talk about the spectrum of sexual gender expressions and how you may acquire HIV. So it's a huge challenge, huge hurdle, but truly if we are honest, transparent, and meet people where they are and the spaces they are, I think we can get someplace in terms of prevention and treatment.
And Dr. Lozzi, if you want to jump on that series of that doc on what Dr. Agwu was speaking about when it comes to young adults, feel free to you can jump into some of these questions.
I think Dr. Agwu did a great job. I mean, one thing I will say, and this doesn't get enough play often when we have these kind of panels, the fact that there are so many experts that look like us on this panel having this conversation, I think is critically important, because that's what sets the stage for the people that we talk to and that we're trying to get to be that future of HIV. So that's critically important. I think the other thing, though, as we sort of think about, I mean, this is going to sound terrible in a sense, but oftentimes when I'm here in Texas, but when I moved here from Minnesota in 2010, the thing that shocked me was who was running the organizations that were making the decisions around HIV, right? I was in Texas, and so I made an assumption that it would be BIPOC people, right? And if you look on a lot of boards of FQs and CHCs and a host of things, this is not a bad thing, but I've said this, and this pandemic has exposed it too, you can't talk about us without us, right? And I think if we're having a conversation about a virus that affects predominantly African-American and Hispanic gay men, you got to be at the table. And now I am not a gay man. And a lot of times my patients will tell me, well, how can you treat my HIV if you're not a gay man? And sometimes they say, well, you either have me or you have Todd Smith, who's my professor in the corner. And so I'm the least of the challenging options. But again, I think that's why we have to do and find ways to enable people to, diversity is key in everything, right? Anytime you have a monolith, whether it's all Black, all Hispanic, or all Caucasian, decisions that get made in those rooms will not be representative of the culture and the people that need it. And so when I call them my young kids are coming in, I think like Dr. Agwu said, it's just having an honest and direct conversation, right? I can see, I'm an IT guy, and I can see the traffic in my waiting room, and sometimes it's Grindr and Tinder and all the rest. And I've had people challenge them and shame clients and patients that come in. And I'm like, okay, cool. Let's have a conversation. If you're going to have 5 partners this week, how can we keep you as safe as possible? Are you equals you? Do you need PrEP? Do your partners need PrEP? How do we bring in those 7 people that you're going to have sex with over the next week to be on PrEP prior to those engagements? Right? It's not a shaming conversation. And I think as a healthcare community, unfortunately, historically, we don't do a good job of meeting people where they want to be met. And I think my last sort of analogy is, it used to make me laugh when I was at Texas Tech and in charge of their HIV program, that we were sending letters out to 22-year-olds. And I was like, this is crazy. No 22-year-old's gonna read a letter. And even if they get the letter, they're not responding to it. Let's do a text messaging campaign. And it wasn't until we went rogue and did a secret Google Voice campaign, we reduced no-shows by 60% in under 18 months, right? And so those are the kind of things that I sort of push leaders of programs around the country to think differently. We can't be in our sort of boxes and we're sort of getting older, right? We have to really think about what's the community and the group that's coming in to see us.
I'd love to add to that, Nicholas, if that's okay. You know, I definitely think we've talked about COVID, we've talked about HIV, but I think we would be remiss if we didn't talk about what's happened over the past year and a half with systemic structural racism and where it's become part of every conversation, and almost to the point that it's a buzzword that we need to follow with real action, understand what that means. It is no accident that the same communities, the same areas that are disparately impacted by both those epidemics and what underlies that. And so, yes, people of color, but why people of color and diverse people not at the table, and what is the impact of that? I think if we're really going to disentangle the issues and address the issues, we have to be able to not just say, let's talk about race, but let's really talk about what that means in terms of access, outcomes, et cetera, in a meaningful and intentional.
Thank you so much,
Absolutely.
Dr. Agwu. We have a number of questions in the chat here. The audience is very lively today. So I'm going to turn to the chat a little bit, and I'd love if you guys could provide some brief responses. We have from Miona Short asks, and I'll direct this to you, Dr. Alozi. As virtual care companies start to pop up and emphasize the needs of specific communities, like LGBT specific focus with Folks Health or musculoskeletal focus with Hinge Health, do you think there will be an increase of HIV specific virtual care clinics?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think I'll kind of go backwards. When I was a chief health informatics officer, one of the things we used to talk about to systems in the state was telehealth, right? And it was a struggle to get people to understand what telehealth was. They thought, oh, you want to do a phone visit so that you can see more patients and you will charge us more. And that's what CMS thinks of, right? I think that COVID sort of said, hey, hold my beer. We're going to explain how this works really quickly to you. When we shut down the country and the world, all of a sudden, the same people that had literally told me 90 days earlier, we can't do telehealth, that's not a thing. And by the way, we're not going to pay you for it. All of a sudden it became payment parity, we're going to do it, drive everybody to it. I think the pendulum has probably swung a little bit too far. And I now see people substituting what should be an in-person visit, what should be human contact with tele. What we should know, and I think people know this, but we forget it, is that technology has never been and never will be a replacement for human engagement and interaction. It's just a tool. I tell people all the time, if you're putting in any system, it's PPT. It's the people, it's the process, and then it's the technology. You need the right people with the right process, use the technology to catalyze it, right? And so to answer her specific question, I think there will be companies and startups that are going to try to do that. I think my pushback to all of them will be, you're not a replacement, you're an enhancement or an alternate pathway. I think we call it telehealth right now. I truly believe in a generation, it'll just be healthcare, and there'll be different channels to approach your healthcare. And so I really think that's where we need to find things out. There are patients that I know do not want to come into our clinic, and I'm okay with that, right? They come in and get blood work, and they'll do all their visits online, and that's okay because they're sort of in my safe population. I have some homeless, critical patients, AIDS with multiple comorbidities. I may do one, but we have as an organization decided they got to come in, right? And again, part of it because they're on Ryan White, they will come in anyway because they have to get that renewal. And so Ryan White kind of drives that, which is why Ryan White has better outcomes than commercial insurance across the board. But I think it's never a replacement. It has to be an enhancement piece.
I have a question now for Dr. Agwu. When we had spoken before, you had said that your care, the way you focus it is from the cradle to the grave, as you had put it. One of our Alina Kennedy asks, sorry, my mistake. Kimberly Marcellus asks, what do HIV patients who are living longer need for better end of life care?
This is a really great question. So I think, certainly, as a med peds provider, I see as young as 0, and I have patients in their 60s and older, right? And so we know about 50% of individuals who are living with HIV are over the age of 50. So it is an aging population. And I think one that is oftentimes forgotten. With age comes just comorbidities in general, polypharmacy, et cetera, that we can, and other things from a physical standpoint. but you have depression, loneliness, isolation, and then you have AIDS survivor syndrome, where many people have lived for long periods of time. Many friends have died with HIV. So there's a whole thing. So in terms of what they're needed, and speaking from a provider perspective, and I'd love it if we had a patient on who can talk about this as well. I think they too still need, just because you've been on and taking a pill for whatever years, we still need to talk about options for that population as well. So if we can minimize the burden of what they're taking, whether it's less drugs, different ways to give those drugs, I think they need that as well. We need to make sure we're looking at comorbidities and how they evolve with age and how to prevent those. We need to also think about psychological and cognitive challenges in terms of frailty, et cetera, because we know that impacts life, and depression, mental health, et cetera, in fact, impacts how you engage in care, adherence, et cetera. I think we also need to think about the caretakers and the 360. How are we supporting them through all those things? How do they get to their appointments? How do they get to, if we're not thinking about those and just looking at them at viral suppression, we're going to miss the boat for 50% of those who are aging, some in their 70s and 80s.
Thank you so much, Dr. Agwu. For Dr. Alozi, Paul Bedo asks, in many communities, we're seeing alarming rises in STIs, including syphilis, gonorrhea, chlamydia, etc. How should prevention, testing, and treatment for STIs coordinate with the higher profile efforts to eliminate HIV/AIDS?
Yeah, great question. I think one of the biggest things into that question, unpacking it, is one of the, not failures, one of the challenges that I think we've had historically, and DISHES does this, or HHSC does this, everything's separated, right? It used to be HIV, then it was TB, then it was STIs, right? And some states have them put back together. And I think Dr. Agwu knows this more than any of us. That AYA population, right, that adolescent and young adult population, just has to be a conversation about sexual health or just their global health care. And sexual health comes in all of those ways. It can be syphilis, gonorrhea, chlamydia, HPV, PrEP, post-HIV acquisition. And so I think where I've seen people do it best is where it's not bundled out, or rather, it's not separated out. It's a conversation around sexual health. And we've actually sort of pivoted over the last year and a half, 2 years specifically to that, right? We used to be a standalone HIV clinic. Then we added hepatitis C. And right before the pandemic, realized that as we onboarded PrEP 2018, 2019, we're getting a lot of partners, or HIV, a lot of partners, right? And so we just realized that if majority of our patients coming in were below the age of 30, they were coming in with 1 to 3 partners, that it would be remiss of us, and actually a failure upon us, if we weren't talking about sexual health as a continuum. And I think we're doing extra genital testing now and a whole host of other things that actually have to set that stage. And so to answer that person's question kind of directly, I think that if you're in an organization that only does one, there are ways to get others. And people always say no money, and I get it. Without money, there's no mission. You got to keep the lights on. But there are a host of ways, at your local health department, through HHSC, that you can get in-kind donations of testing supplies. People don't know this, but a lot of the blood testing companies, the Quests and the LabCorps, actually have an indigent program where patients can come in and have no cost whatsoever for STI testing, right? And we did a poll recently, 80% of Texas did not know that. Right. And so you have to enhance those conversations so that organizations and clinicians that are interested in that can access those ways. Because again, I think it's frustrating as a patient to come in and they say, yeah, we want to work with you, but it's going to cost you $400 to do all these tests and get these medications. And so that can be a challenge in the private sector. But I think it has to be bundled together.
So Dr. Alozi, another viewer question that I think vibes with something that we had discussed earlier. Elena Kennedy asks, Elena Kennedy says she is curious what med schools / training programs are doing to combat these issues amongst providers themselves, these issues being stigmatization, using language like adherence instead of thinking more about competing priorities. And she also adds, remembering that sometimes even one bad provider experience can really turn a patient off from any care. So as you had said to me earlier, what needs to be done in med schools for this newer generation of providers to really make sure that they are well equipped to handle and speak respectfully to their patients and to them?
Absolutely. I think Dr. Agwu sort of touched on this when we talked about COVID, right? When we talked about COVID, unmasking, inequity, and differences that we've known existed in our society for 100 plus years, right? It's funny to me that people are suddenly saying, oh my goodness, the Delta variant's here. And who knew that the South would have this low rate of vaccination? HIV doctors knew because it's what we've been doing for the last 40 years, right? And so I think that, anyway, it drives me crazy. But I think the key thing is that there's so many medical schools and they're all run by different motives, right? They're for-profit, nonprofit, community, academic. And I think one of the things, again, you can't have a conversation about us without us. The more different types of people are in the teaching space of either a Hopkins or University of Minnesota, where I went to, or Texas Tech, where I used to work, or a Stanford, or a Miami, or a Grady, right? Chicago, those are the only ways that you can start to have these conversations. When you look at medical schools that are really monolithic, unfortunately, what has happened is it's not a deliberate thing. They're not saying deliberately, we have set our curriculum not to talk about inequity. But if it doesn't affect you sometimes, you don't think about it, right? But once you're able to bring in that diversity, either in your staffing, your physician, your professors, and especially your students, those conversations come up. And so I think there are a host of medical schools across the country who have started creating deliberate curriculum to talk about this. In a lot of places, it's catch as catch can, unfortunately. But I think as we go forward, and I'll defer to Dr. Agwu to talk about what they're doing at Hopkins and around the Baltimore area, I think it just has to be something that's codified, right? Where you're having these deliberate conversations. They're not going to be comfortable, but I think it is what it is.
So, I mean, I think I completely agree. I think moving it though from just each individual responsibility and saying, not to call any organization out, but the AMC or the people who accredit the medical schools and saying, you have to have curriculum on X, Y, and Z. This is what it doesn't fit that criteria. Because if we don't, again, intentionally require them, then they may not, or they think they have it and it satisfies, right? And there's huge diversity in the kinds of curriculum that you may have. And so let's say what the criteria need to be and have people who know what the criteria look like that, evaluate that curriculum, and then say if it applies or doesn't.
Yeah, great point. Great point.
Now, Dr. Agwu, Chelsea Boyd asked, on the topic of meeting people where they are, how do you see PrEP being integrated into other harmful reduction services? Are there any challenges?
So Dr. Lizzie and I are both ID docs, and I can't tell you the number of times I see, and I've seen 13, 14, 15-year-olds come in with new diagnoses who had just seen their doctor, their primary care doctor, the week before, the month before. HIV wasn't even discussed. Their sexual history was not discussed. And so I think we're sort of the choir here, talking amongst ourselves, ID docs, and saying, yes, we should talk about sexual health. When you look at providers who see adolescents where sex oftentimes happens, the average duration of a sexual history is 36 seconds, right? And that's a study that's public, 36 seconds. So it is moving into the primary care settings. And let me expand what that means. It's primary care providers. It is a school health nurse. It is really changing who needs to bring that conversation up in a non-stigmatizing way, because garbage in, garbage out. So if you ask the question as, oh, you're having sex, right? Or you're not having sex, right? Or you assume people are having sex by whatever preconceived notions you think, you've already shut the conversation out and you've not opened the channel to potentially get PrEP. So I think it's moving all the way back and normalizing sexual health, just normalizing sexuality. Our country has a problem with sexuality. There's a lot of sex, but we don't want to talk about sex, right? Particularly in people of a certain age. We want to call body parts different things and not be able to get conversation started. So if it's how do we do this, I think we have to move all the way back where we normalize sexual curiosity, sexual interest, and truly ask things in a way that is not stigmatizing and does not assume and shut the conversation down. And then with that, primary providers, pharmacists, literally frontline people who are seeing urgent care center, we need to have that information there where it's clearly a conversation starter, but then you have some place to go with it. So status neutral. You get to the point where somebody's asking you to get tested, and you get tested, and then you call them and say, oh, you were negative, keep doing what you're doing. You have failed. I like to use the word fail. You have failed, because there is a thing to do no matter what that result is. There's a thing to do no matter what someone says their sexual status is. No, I'm not sexually active. Sexually active right now, like where we are right now. And did you have sex? Yes, right? It's clarifying and making it comfortable so people feel like, yeah, I can ask them about that, right? So that's
Yeah,
how you get to that.
yeah, that's fantastic. You were basically answering a question that was posed by Naresh Kumar, who was along the same veil, saying like, how do we encourage and empower providers to bring up the conversation about sexual health history in outpatient clinic settings in communities where there is a stigma and the subject is otherwise taboo?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So were you asking me to answer that one too?
You can go right ahead if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, no, I think part of it is that we have to get over our own hangups. And you talked about, providers and what are they teaching? We all have our own hangups, so we bring things to the table. And so if you have your own issues about, oh, what that's going to be encouraging people to have sex. If I ask them about the HPV vaccine, that's going to be right. Or asking them if they want PrEP, I'm telling them to be risky. Like, we've got to get over our stuff, check our stuff at the door, because we bring that into those encounters and then shut down the possibility of potentially getting someone to truly prevention or to treatment free.
Mhm. A
Go ahead,
quick
Dr.
question.
Woods. Sorry, jumping in.
No. I mean, I think that's great. I think you sort of alluded to it. I mean, Nick, what I would say is if you go to the doctor, one of the questions that patients always hate is about sex, drugs, and money, right? Nobody wants to talk about their finances when they come into a doctor. They don't want to talk about how much sex they're having, and they definitely don't want to talk about drugs. So it's HIV, hepatitis C, and disparities across the board. And so we just, like she said, we got to be better. Just getting over it, just getting over those things and having a conversation.
Can I add a comment to someone talked about just rising STIs, right? So there are, and for positive individuals, negative individuals. And what I think that speaks to is essentially, instead of saying, are you using condoms, et cetera, why don't we just ask people how they like to have sex? If you ask people how you like to have sex, then they'll like, oh, I don't like to use condoms. Then you are having a conversation about, okay, how can we move forward to minimize your risk the way you like to have sex? Different conversation, right?
Absolutely.
And now, before we get into some of my final questions, I wanted to take this question from Will Savush, who asks, can you talk about current trends in how patients you see now versus before the COVID pandemic, both for PrEP and disease control regime? So can you talk about current trends in how many patients you see now versus before the COVID pandemic, both for PrEP and disease control regimes? Has the volume of patients picked up, or is it still being impacted by COVID?
Wow. We were just having a conversation in our clinic meeting. And so our volume has picked up, right? So COVID obviously shut a whole bunch of things down. We pivoted to online really quickly within a couple of weeks. We already had an online platform because we use Athena Health for our EMR. And so a lot of people wanted to do that. But as we came out here in El Paso, we had our worst sort of month, November, December. As January came, vaccines came in and they were giving them out and we had more vaccines than we needed. In the last probably 4 to 5 months, we've seen a dramatic increase, especially in PrEP and MPEP, right? And so it's been we've had to hire more people and it's just changed the whole dynamic of what we do. I think people are engaging more. They want to engage more. Sex is a great thing and people are having more sex. And so we're, in a way, right, we're in the business of sex and how to help people, like Dr. Agu said, have the best type of sex that they can in the safest way possible. And so COVID, in a sense, has driven a lot of things. And AYA is a big sector that we're focusing on and seeing a lot more calls and website traffic on.
I think for us, to go back to a little bit about the telemedicine, we really, we also pivoted very early. Pivot is such an overused word, but we pivoted early. And to be honest, we've been texting and stuff with our young people for a long time and had been asking for virtual visits. And so our show rates for clinic visits were the highest that they've been in my experience, right? Particularly for our young people who've been asking for it. Surprisingly, when we look back at our visits, still 70% of them still wanted virtual visits. They had in-person visits, I should say. So they use the virtual platform, but then they still at times wanted to come in. And I think that speaks to really meeting people where they are at a given day. You have to work, an online visit may happen. So we have to be flexible with that. And I think we do need to advocate for maintaining that, because what I see is some rolling back as facility fees come into play, et cetera. And some organizations are pulling back on those virtual visits and knowing that there's a place for them. Unfortunately for us, we saw, I think we said 14 new diagnoses among young AYA in the last 6 months of the year. To put into perspective, my pediatric adolescent HIV/AIDS program is a relatively small program. So that's 150 kids, and of those 14 new in a year, when the year before was like 3 new diagnoses in that program. So just to say there was a bit of that, and some were kids who had been on PrEP who fell out because of whatever issues with COVID. So yes, record number of visits, more virtual visits, and unfortunately a banner year for diagnoses for
One more quick reader question. Laura Durda asks, what should be the focus of future funding opportunities for clinics, nonprofits, hospitals, et cetera?
I mean, we all have our wish lists, right, Dr.
Yes.
Ogden?
Tell us the list, please. Tell us the list.
In an academic health center is different than a small community group like mine. So here in El Paso, my thing is always staff. If you give me navigators, I always tell people, when I show up, I'm just showing up. All the hard work has been done by the registration, the navigators, Uber Health, whatever it is, transportation, HAQA, to get people housing. I still have one of my most sort of touching anecdotes about a lady that came in from Angola. I'm in El Paso, we're Hispanic. Angola does not speak Spanish, by the way, they speak Portuguese. And I knew that from like high school, but I had forgotten. Nobody spoke her language, got her on meds, did great. And then suddenly over her last trimester got really worse, viral loads in the 100,000s. And we're like, aren't you taking it? We thought it was GI stuff. Come to find out, she was homeless and sleeping in cars. She was breaking into cars and sleeping in them. Called the health department, got her a house. And within those, it's integrase inhibitors, right? Within 7 weeks, she was undetectable, has had 3 babies since, now speaks English, Spanish, and works at a nonprofit elsewhere. It's those wraparound services that we need more than doctors, right? We as doctors, other people can do it. I think that'd be my biggest thing. Then the other thing is, anything we can do around education, I think is critical. We gotta train and ensure that we reduce the stigma barrier to the next generation of healthcare coming in. Sorry, I talked too much because I know we're up against it.
No, but I'd love to add, because we're doing a wish list. I think, everything Dr. Lozzi said, I think he's my long lost brother. I think additionally, it's not just the education, but it's the pipeline, the workforce of individuals who have knowledge about HIV and are caring for patients who are living with HIV is shrinking and aging. And if we don't prime that pump, we're going to have a crisis. I think it's expanding who takes care of patients who live with HIV in the best way. In addition to housing, et cetera, there was some amazing funding called Emergent Needs Funding that came out with Ryan White funding this past year, which allowed us to actually do things that we normally would not be able to do on the Ryan White, which is federal funding for HIV, like pay for that last driving lesson so you now can drive yourself to your appointments and work, et cetera. Things that actually make people's lives better. And when you make people's lives better, they're more likely to adhere, whether it's as for themselves, for PrEP, or what have you. And so thinking broader, staffing, absolutely, and making sure we're not cutting every year, but also just things to actually facilitate life and minimize this.
And just one quick final question for both of you. What keeps you optimistic that we will see an end to this epidemic?
Dr. Ogden?
Yeah, so I think what keeps me optimistic is that there continues to be funding. There continues to be funding about not just treatment, but there continues funding about cure. Oftentimes young people are lost in the conversation about cure. I think treatment options for people, prevention options for people that meets them literally where they are, where they can't take a pill every day. So we're thinking about other ways. I think that we're having these conversations, right? We talked about the lack of conversations, but we're having them. Vaccines are still a topic of conversation. So I think, and the young people themselves, I have got to stay optimistic for them because we have a whole generation that are coming up living with HIV and like, we got to do better for me, right? And so they keep me optimistic and keep me in the fight. So that I think that would be it for me. Dr. Lozzi?
Yeah, I'll say something as a personal story. I sort of left clinical care in October of 2019. I thought I wanted to be a hospital administrator and I was going to be a hospital CEO. 6 months into the pandemic, I realized it was the worst decision I'd ever made. I missed my patients. I missed care. I missed providing that one-on-one and sort of policy stuff that I can do in Texas around people living with HIV. And so realigning my sort of core makes me happy. I think the patients that Dr. Agwu talked about, I mean, they're amazing. I mean, I can hear them laughing in the corner. I don't know if you guys can. I have no idea what's going on there with my nurse practitioner and clinical pharmacist. That keeps me happy. And the true belief, apart from the research in the future, and it's exciting, I actually believe that we have the tools from a pharmaceutical standpoint today, if we could bridge these disparities and get people, I mean, like it's the continuum of care, right? It's treatment status neutral, right? If we could actually get people PrEP and get people undetectable, U equals U, within a decade, we could probably eliminate HIV, right? And so a lot of our things are not chemical or pharmaceutical, they're structural, inequity, and we got to figure out a way to fix those disparities. And so as long as we continue to have these conversations, Nick, I think those are the keys. And so kudos to you and your group for inviting us. I'm blessed and honored to be here. And Dr. Agwu and I have, we have linguistic names that are aligned in the Igbo community. And so maybe we are a long lost brother or sister. So appreciate it.
My brother.
Thank you both so much. And with that last thought, I think we're ready to wrap up this STAT event. Thank you so much to our featured speakers, to our event sponsor, ViiV Healthcare, and to all of you who joined us today, Dr. Agwu, Dr. Alozi, and Dr. Gale. It's been wonderful getting to know you all through the planning process for this event and through this very stimulating conversation. I think our readers are logging off today with a lot of insight. And to all of you out there, thanks for asking some really great questions. I mean, the chat box is going crazy with questions. This seems like something we need to do again, really, because there's just so much interest there. So thank you all so much. I just want to say to everyone, just a heads up that our next virtual event, Gene Therapies Next Steps, will be taking place on August 12th. STAT's Damien Gardet will be bringing together a panel of experts in the field to talk about what advances still need to be made as the first gene therapies start to hit the market. More information and registration details to join us can be found on our website. Until then, stay safe and be well, everyone. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, everybody.